Red Line.
Welcome to Radio Sputnik and its weekend program Red Line with me, Julia Lyubova.
And Sergei Strokan.
This is one of our wrap-up programs summing up the results of the passing year, and this is what we want to highlight as watershed events of 2014. Ukraine that shook the world. After 2 decades of a peaceful transition from communist rule to democracy, Ukraine was dragged into a bloody conflict which abruptly put the nation of 40 million people on the global map of hotspots and proxy wars. The conflict with 2 restive eastern regions bidding for independence from Kiev is seen as the most serious challenge to the European security after the Balkan War. Russia West, back to the Iron Curtain. The 2014 would go into history as a critical test for the post-communist world, with Russia and the West locking horns over the crisis in Ukraine and waging the war of sanctions no one could have imagined a year ago. While the US and EU leadership shows no sign of abandoning sanctions, the policy of isolating Russia is getting growingly unpopular in the West, denounced by prominent political and public figures and representatives of business elite. And also 2014 for Obama, high flyer turned lame duck. President Obama has passed through the most difficult year in office, suffering one humiliating blow after another. Mounting domestic problems, from racial tensions to torture scandal, loss of control of the Congress followed by America's diminishing global role, and a failure of reset policy with Russia sent Obama's ratings to a historic low. So let us come to our first section beyond the headlines to address the crisis in Ukraine, which has passed through the bloodiest year in its 23-year independent history, with violent clashes in southeastern regions, claiming thousands of lives, dragging the country into a conflict. Escalating Ukrainian crisis has intensified international efforts aimed at putting an end to the bloody conflict in the heart of Central Europe. However, peace process initiated in Belarus' capital of Minsk came to a deadlock.
Well, Julia, I think all of us have to agree that what happened to Ukraine can be described as the year of madness. And no one of us really could have imagined a year ago that basically peaceful nation, which was just passing through the transition from Soviet rule to democracy, all of a sudden would emerge as one of the hotbed of tensions in the center of Europe, and would become one of the border contentions between Russia and the West. So, of course, now there are different interpretations of what happened to Ukraine, why Ukraine has found itself in such a desperate situation. And there's a lot of criticism of Russia's position in the West, as you understand. But let me state itself very clearly that we don't want to impose any solution on Ukraine. The only thing what we want, that Ukrainian solution would be found within Ukraine itself. And this what was clearly stated at President Putin's annual press conference, and this what was also revealed in Foreign Minister Lavrov's interview to France 24, when he said that Russia has no plans to annex eastern regions, and Russia doesn't impose any federalization, but Russia really wants constitutional reforms, which would obviously give representatives of political parties and regions the right to decide on how to select regional leaders. And this is really genuine, legitimate right.
Absolutely. Well, we can ask our first expert on some of these questions. Let's welcome our first guest, Alexander Domrin, Professor of High School of Economics, who joins us in our studio in Moscow. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.
With the President Putin's press conference on 18th of December, he didn't really give out any sort of new scandalous sort of statements, I suppose, on Ukraine. But with Sergei Lavrov, in an interview to France 24, he said new things, such as, for instance, that Petro Poroshenko is the only hope for Ukraine, and also that Moscow is not interested in federalization, is that it's up to Ukraine to decide what he wants to do. So are these new signals that Moscow is sending about its the way that it wants to deal with Ukraine now, and also what does this change in the sort of rhetoric? What does it mean on the ground?
Russia doesn't have too much choice as far as Ukraine is concerned. Looking at Ukraine, I have this feeling that I'm watching Groundhog Day again and again, and actually what happens in Ukraine is a Groundhog Day. You remember that movie, of course, with Bill Murray, and you remember, well, the situation there. One coup after another, one revolution after another. And people are absolutely desperate. In the end, democracy is a process. I don't see this process in Ukraine. And I believe that with support of Russia, with this understanding of Putin that he expresses again and again, Ukraine will start understanding democracy not as a kind of a goal, but rather a process.
Alexander, but you are speaking about this one coup coming after another. But at the same time, we see that blame game in Russia's relations with the West. So probably Ukraine is used just a pretext to put pressure on Russia.
Absolutely. Ukraine is just a tool in some strategy of the West, even though sometimes friends of mine in the West disagree with me that the West actually exists. They say that there are different interests that America and Europe, for instance, have in this part of the world. But nevertheless, you remember when your colleagues from CNN once tried to find Ukraine on the map, and they found it somewhere on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Nobody cares about Ukraine in the West, except probably some people whose parents, grandparents, ancestors lived in Ukraine and then moved to America or to Canada. But in the end, Ukraine is just a tool in some strategic interests of the West regarding Russia.
Red Line.
Well, let's go to our next guest, Jan van Benthem, the Netherlands Dagblad, the Netherlands Daily, and foreign affairs commentator there. Mr. Benthem, thank you very much for joining us. With the recent EU summit in Brussels, several European leaders said that they don't want to impose any more sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. So does this mean that the EU is, satisfied with the sort of new path that Moscow is taking when it comes to Ukraine? And exactly what steps were they, if you know what they are? What do you think this means for the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, if you look at the last summit in Brussels of yesterday, you see that there is quite some unified position regarding sanctions to Russia. There is no talk about new sanctions. It is about real implementation of what the European Union already had decided. And there are some new sanctions, for instance, that travel operators are not allowed to offer new travels to, for instance, Crimea. And so no holidays to Crimea from the European Union. The position has not really changed. There are some Eastern European member states of the EU who want to have another stand. You do have some discussion in Germany also about the economic consequences of the sanctions, but as a total, the European Union yesterday was quite unified in these are the sanctions and we want to maintain them. And it also Donald Tusk, the chairman of the EU, said that we need to have a responsible behavior regarding Russia that needs to be more than reactive and defensive. So there needs to be a policy of the European Union. And that is new. I'm quite critical of Western politicians. I think that the European Union and the United States have made a big mistake in the first moments of the coming crisis on the Crimea. I wrote very early this year, before all the conflicts really started, that the Western leaders should recognize Russian interests in the Crimea because the Crimea was Russian from history. I'm a historian, so next to being foreign commentator, so that my view is a little different. And the West didn't do that. They used hard and forceful words, and Russia also reacted hard and forceful. So the conflict started really there in this misconception about what the Crimea meant. But after that, you see that it has evolved to a complete new level. And that level means that you need to think about a new policy. The present policy in West and East doesn't work. And in the West, politicians up to now have been reacting to developments. So without a real clearly subscribed goal, they have reacted to the development where Russia has acted. And that difference is one of the bases of the conflict. There is no talk about what really in the future, what could be a good solution, in my opinion.
Mr. Jan, what you're saying is very interesting. Let me just develop on that. So, as this was the year when Ukraine really shook Europe and the world, does it mean, you see, that in the coming year, European Union and Russia has to come up with one just positive, united agenda to understand that this is really a challenge and threat? Yes,
I've written that several times in my magazine. I've been talking to Europarliamentarians, also Europarliamentarians who are discussing things with Russia on a practical level, like agricultural issues, etc. They need to come together. Western leaders don't shout to Russia, don't take the telephone to call President Vladimir Putin. Go to Moscow together, discuss this issue. Do not react only.
Mr. Jan, but then in such a situation there should be no room for blame game, because if you have blame game, there will be no confidence, there will be no common stand.
No, but that's exactly what both parties are doing. In the press conference of President Putin, he blamed the West very extensively of the conflict. The West blames Vladimir Putin very extensively of the conflict. And both have reasonable arguments to do so. But they should not say that. The West should not say it to the West. The Russian president shouldn't say that in Russian presidential press conferences. They should talk to each other.
Red Line.
All right, well, let's go to our next guest, Arkady Moshes, director of the research program of EU Eastern Neighbourhood at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, who joins us on the phone from Helsinki. Mr. Moshes, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello.
We've been hearing a sort of a different rhetoric now from both the EU and from Moscow. The EU are saying that they don't want to impose any more sanctions on Russia. So does this mean that the EU is satisfied with the way that Moscow is going now, with the sort of new direction it's taking with Ukraine? And also, do you also sense that Moscow is changing its direction with Ukraine?
I think that Moscow is certainly signaling that a new round of escalation is not going to come, and it is not interested in the one. However, whether Moscow is signaling that it is really ready for a compromise remains to be seen, because quite important things are not yet happening, namely Ukrainian-Russian border is still not controlled by the Ukrainian authorities or even by the OSCE, and humanitarian convoys do enter the territory which Moscow says it recognizes as a territory of Ukraine, and that means a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. So we are in a somewhat kind of less belligerent mood than we were 4 months ago, but this is still a very, very long way to go towards even kind of proper stabilization of the situation in the east of Ukraine.
I have a question to our two guests, since both of you are located in Europe. So, as you know, this new Ukrainian revolution was launched under the banners of European integration slogan. People were saying that at Maidan that Ukraine is Europe. But is European Union ready really to absorb, to meet those expectations of
no,
Ukrainians?
It is not.
Yes, maybe probably you start then.
It is not. I've been talking in the European Parliament also when there were Ukrainian delegations, or even under the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych. And what you sense in the European Union very broadly is that the European Union itself is in crisis. The European elite can talk about enlargement. The European population has had it. There's a very thorough, very intense enlargement fatigue in Europe. They do not want to have new member states. They do not want to invest in new members anymore, because the strict austerity policy in the economic crisis has led to a very unstable political situation in several European member states itself. And even in the Netherlands, where I am, we have a very nationalist party now, which in the polls would do the best when we would have elections nowadays. So that would be the number one. And that is a frightening development, which is of more concern to the EU than Ukraine.
Mr. Moshes, what's your take on that?
Well, European Union is certainly not ready for Ukraine's enlargement. The thing is that we are not talking about enlargement any time in the next 20 years. We are talking, or 30. We are talking about the need to have the reforms in Ukraine, which would bring Ukraine closer to the European Union. But the actual question on the agenda is the following. The European Union has kind of committed itself to build the relationship of association with Ukraine, which should, over time, bring about transformations in Ukraine. Ukraine has committed itself to adopt about 80% of the acquis communautaire. I mean, I'm not saying this is doable, but if this is done, Ukraine will be practically one step from de facto being a member of the enlarged European economic zone and hopefully the prosperity zone as well. So maybe we should be talking about the legal commitments that the European Union has already taken before Ukraine, rather than politicize the issue and indeed antagonize the public opinion in Europe by mentioning words like enlargement and economic assistance. We are talking about much more technocratic approach that the European Union, Brussels, has already chosen vis-à-vis Ukraine, but there's no way to go just back very much from this approach, because it's a legal commitment.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of our guests for their analysis. Arkady Moshes, Director of the Research Programme of EU Eastern Neighbourhood at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. And thank you to Jan van Benthem, the Netherlands Dagblad, the Netherlands Daily, Foreign Affairs commentator there. And also thank you to our guest in our studio, Alexander Domrin, Professor of High School of Economics. And still to come in our programme, Russia West back to the Iron Curtain. The 2014 would go in history as a critical test for the post-communist world, with Russia and the West locking horns over the crisis in Ukraine and waging the war of sanctions no one could have imagined a year ago. While the US and EU leadership show no signs of abandoning sanctions, the policy of isolating Russia is getting growingly unpopular in the West, denounced by prominent political and public figures and representatives of business elites. And also 2014 for Obama, high flyer turned lame duck. President Obama has passed through the most difficult year in office, suffering one humiliating blow after another. Mounting domestic problems from racial tensions to torture scandals, loss of control of the Congress, followed by America's diminishing global role and failure of reset policy with Russia, send Obama's ratings to a historic low. Stay with us.